Now, Neil Reimer co-founded the venture capital investment firm Index Ventures in 1996, and since then has been quietly supporting and nurturing companies from the early stage of their life through billion-dollar exits. The firm's noteworthy investments include names like Last.fm, Betfair, which went public last year with an opening price of $2.4 billion, as well as Skype. Earlier, I sat down with Neil, and among the issues we discussed was the fact that many investors in the U.S. think valuations at earlier stages are very high. I asked him if the sentiment was shared by investors in Europe.
I think that problem, if it is a problem, is more of an issue in the U.S. because there's such a frothy market right now. There are a number of companies going public at very high valuations, and I think people are generalizing that set of conditions to earlier stage companies, and you have lots of companies that are claiming that they're destined for that kind of greatness and therefore demanding very high valuations. I think entrepreneurs in Europe are a little bit more balanced in their view. And many times more realistic, and are not necessarily claiming that they should be worth $500 million today because they'll be worth $5 billion 3 years from now. So I think that the valuations in Europe are a little bit more reasonable.
So what's the view among investors in Europe about a potential bubble in internet startups in the U.S.?
European investors, I think, are looking at technology as one sector among many. Remember that European investors right now have other issues on their mind with what's going on in Europe and the debt crisis in general. But I think that they tend to look at technology stocks on an individual basis and evaluate them as individual businesses on their own merits rather than as part of a club or a group of stocks where if something happens to one of them, that will be reflected on all of them.
Now, U.S. startups have talked a lot about this issue of cloning in Asia and in Europe. How significant a problem is cloning?
I think a lot has been said about cloning. I think you want to be careful about the distinction between just having competitors and having clones. There are definitely clones, and there are cases where people have just taken a site and knocked it off to such a degree that the two sites are really indistinguishable except for the name, and they've done it kind of shamelessly. And some of these companies even go so far as to confuse customers by calling them up and posing as the company that they're imitating. I think that's clearly wrong, and that's clearly cloning, and I think companies probably have legal recourse in those circumstances. But I think, generally speaking, many companies have always inspired themselves from what others have done in other countries, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're cloning, they're just competing.
So what's your advice to your portfolio companies in terms of when to go international? Do they do it as soon as they can? Do they wait until the product is perfect?
I think that traditionally U.S. companies have had more luxury of time in figuring out when to go international. And traditionally you had companies that would start off in the U.S. market, sell their product or service into a very large monolithic market with one media market and one currency and one set of tax rules, really an ideal market to launch into. And then take their time to hone their business model and then appoint somebody to go after the rest of the world. And I think today that's a lot harder to do because all of the services, particularly on the internet, all of the services that exist for acquiring users, for authentication, for payment, for distribution, for monetization, are really a level playing field for companies wherever they might start off. So the likelihood is if you have a great idea and you are providing value to users, you are going to inspire companies in Europe or elsewhere in the world. And you do have to think about getting out ahead of them before they take market share from you.
Spotify is a good example of the reverse, a European company that's been very successful now coming to the U.S. What do you think are the prospects for Spotify's success here?
We like Spotify a lot. We like the team. We like the product that they've built. And I think Spotify is a good example of a European business that puts a very strong emphasis on usability, on design, on the core set of features that will really delight users, and that has done extremely well coming from a base in Northern Europe to conquer the world. And we think that the product offering that they have will delight users in the U.S. as well. We think they'll do well.
Neil Reimer also discussed the differences between American and European tech investing. He says Europe only discovered the venture capital model in the last 10 years and thinks that from many perspectives it is still an infinite market compared to Silicon Valley.